waffle. Cease the waffle.
Sorry.
We are live to the public, so I shall start the meeting. I have, I think, 3 pleasant duties to do before we move to the agenda. First of all, to welcome Jim Arnold, who is our first and therefore very treasured independent member, and I'm sure I express all our view and I say I hope he enjoys the company of the members of the Audit Committee and finds the work that we do here valuable and interesting. We look forward to a long and pleasant association with you, Jim.
Thank you, Brian, and so do I. And look forward to the meeting and to taking an interest and participating. Thank you.
It is so long since we last met. It is so long since we last met that even though Barry Hanson has been in post, was promoted to Head of Policy and Government, a great title, that, Head of Policy and Government. Is there anything left you're not head of, Barry? That I don't think we've had the opportunity to congratulate Barry. So I take this time, and I hope you join me in congratulating him, Barry, on his promotion. Yes. Well done, Barry. Well done.
Thank you.
And then another promotion to announce that you all know, but I think we ought to take the opportunity again of wishing Katie well, now that she is our head of audit. And though we know both Barry and Katie well, it is nice to see them both still with this organisation in much higher posts. And I think it speaks wonder that all our 3 principal officers here are all internal promotions. It shows that somewhere in Shropshire Council, people are learning the arts for which they were originally trained and able to deploy them on behalf of the Shropshire public. So congratulations on this first opportunity to Barry and to Katie. That having been all said, we can now move to the agenda. I see no absences, so I presume there are no apologies and no notification of substitutes. You're all, I suppose I'd better read this for the sake of him, because he's a new member. Members are reminded that they must declare their disclosable pecuniary interests and other registrable or non-registrable interests in any matter being considered at the meeting, as set out in Appendix B of the Members' Code of Conduct, and consider if they should leave the room prior to the item being considered. Further advice can be sought from the monitoring officer in advance of the meeting. Are there any pecuniary interests of which you are aware? There being no one offering any pecuniary interests, we can now move to the minutes of the previous meeting of the 14th of February. If anybody can remember it. Before we go on to discuss it, would somebody with a good memory be prepared to move the minutes as a true and correct record? Thank you, Rosemary. And is there a seconder for that? Oh, several seconds, right. Okay, so do we agree it's a true and correct record? Silence indicates agreement. I have several matters to raise on the minutes, but I offer the opportunity to members to raise anything if they wish. No? Oh, sorry, Simon.
Yeah, I have a few.
Right, good. We'll go through.
I'll be quick.
Go through yours first.
Right, okay. First of all, I'd like to thank Michelle for sort of the background on the dog warden issue. But I don't see the dog warden actually coming up in the agenda. I'm beginning to wonder if the dog warden is actually a fictitious character, because I think it was probably, was it November, when we last were expecting to have an update as to their audit. I mean, but
Katie has the full answer to that one now.
Absolutely.
I'll then come back to your other issue.
right, I'll just run through the next two. On page 9, I think it's the executive director explained that local authorities could not go bust as they are underwritten by central government. I mean, this is actually accurate because I believe they can go bust. But my concern where this comes from is that we have exposure to local authorities, and I've always found that quite a difficult one.
Right, well,
So I'll just park that.
James
and
will answer.
I'll park that. And then the final one is on page 10. And it was on the anti-fraud e-training, I think. And was there any action? Let's see if I can find them. Specifics there, forgive me. Bribery, corruption strategy and measures under and detailed in the report to manage associated with prevention and detection. Yeah, I think it was whether there's any follow-up action to that.
Right, thank you for that.
Right, that's it.
Katie has the full response to the dog warden situation, so we'll go to Katie now.
Thank you, Chair. The dog warden's report is on the agenda for the July meeting, and they've confirmed they're attending to present that report in July. This meeting was scheduled for the statement of accounts, so the full agenda is coming in July for those other management reports.
Okay, perhaps you'd answer the second. Well, going bust.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So yes, I did state that local authorities can't go bust as they were underwritten by central government. Yeah, that is a statement of fact. They the way in which local authorities are delivered under statute does mean that the services that are provided by the local authority have to be delivered. So if a local authority can look like it's going bust, a local authority can put itself in a position where it would go bust, but what actually happens is the mechanisms then come in from central government to either make a special provision for use of capital, provision for increasing the council tax above referendum limits. There's a number of mechanisms that are in place that then ensure that happens. In relation to, and this was in relation to treasury management, so this was about borrowing from other authorities, that security is underwritten on that basis.
Okay, thank you.
Well, the third one, I'm not quite sure which officer.
Yeah. I'm quite happy to withdraw the third one, actually. I apologise for that. That was
Okay.
a bit waffling.
Anybody else? Right, I've got one or two things. Page 3, bottom paragraph says it's in relation to the view at the moment was that the audit plan could still be completed by year end and would give sufficient coverage to ensure that an audit opinion could be formed. However, it was still a risk. Can we have an update on that? Sally?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. At the last meeting, we were reporting that some of the work that was externally provided by internal audit providers had started later in the year. The completion of that work in the final quarter sped up. And we're now in a position where we've just got a couple of areas outstanding to finalise. So the completion of the audit plan is going to be reported to the July Audit Committee.
We'll have it in a month's time. Yeah. Okay, that's fine on that. If we turn over the page, page 4, second and third paragraph. The Section 151 officer explained the reason for the delay in contractors starting work, but reassured the committee that the work was still to be delivered over the period. Assurance had been received that the work would be completed by year end. Can we have an update on that, please? Year end having passed.
Again, Chair, that's the point that I just made a moment ago about the report into the July Audit Committee, and that was the completion of the externally provided internal audit work, which has now been substantially complete for 22-23.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I thought the previous one was in relation to the audit plan, whereas, well, I suppose, yes, this is the contractor starting work on the audit plan or carrying out work.
Yeah, so there will be 2 reports going into the July Audit Committee, the first of which is the normal internal audit performance report, the second of which is the annual report, the annual opinion report.
Right.
So the annual opinion report covers all of the audit work undertaken during 22-23, which includes the externally provided internal audit works.
Okay on that. Thank you for that, Barry. And then if we go to page 5, third paragraph down, the section 151 officer explained that there would be a point whereby the internal control environment became a strategic risk if internal audit fell below a certain level, and he agreed to look into this. So I know that you have, James.
Yeah, I have looked into that. What we do on a regular, on annual basis is we review all of our strategic risks. So in relation to where we are this year, as explained by Barry in terms of the outturn position and the ability to form an audit opinion, that at the moment falls below the level that it would be considered a strategic risk, or certainly it would be within our risk appetite. But that will be continually reviewed now that that point has been made.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, that resolves my queries. If members have no other queries, we have already approved the minutes of the correct record. We can now accept the minutes. All in favour of accepting the minutes? Thank you. We can now go on to the public questions. Any public questions?
No public questions have been received.
Good. Member questions?
No member questions have been received.
Thank you. Item 6, the annual government statement, pages 50 to 56. Report of the section 151 officer. James, would you like to introduce this?
Thank you, Chair. I'll give a brief introduction in relation to the annual government statement. So this is a statement that is produced every year and sits alongside the statement of accounts. So it is there to provide assurance that the appropriate governance has been undertaken over the last financial year, and then sat alongside the statement of accounts. That enables an overarching view to be undertaken in relation to the quality and assurance around the accounts and the numbers within that, and the controls and the approach being undertaken by the authority in creating those sets of figures, etc. So the way that we undertake this is that the most senior officers across the organisation are requested to provide information in relation to the governance, the quality of governance, the particular points, the separate principal points that are picked up in section 7.7, so paragraph 7.7. The senior managers are asked to provide their opinion and to provide assurance in relation to those particular issues. That is then all collated and overseen by the executive directors in each of the directorates. They then provide an assurance statement through to the chief executive and the leader of the council. Chief executive and leader of the council then review that, consider it, and then ultimately endorse it by signing that document. This document then is published on our website, and it is brought to audit committee alongside the other items on the agenda today, the outturn report, particularly the statement of accounts, so that overall assurance can be considered. As part of the report, There is Appendix C. Let's start with that one. Appendix C is the annual government statement action plan from 21-22. So this is done on a financial year basis. So 2021-22 financial year, there was an annual government statement and there was an action plan drawn up in relation to that. This is the update in relation to those actions outstanding from that point in time. And then Appendix A provides the annual government statement and associated action plan for the 22-23 financial year, which is the year that's just been closed and for which the statement of accounts is included. Appendix B then shows the framework under which the Code of Governance is pulled together. So I'll leave it at that, but happy to take any questions.
Yes, Roger, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Have several points, but the first one is on page 24 about the enforcement notice from the ICO in relation to FOI response times. I note that, and I also note in the plan at the back, it's going to be December before it's completed, if I read it right. How did that come about? Why did the council put itself in a position of having an enforcement notice from the ICO? And I note this title of this part of the report is respecting the rule of law. FOIs are stipulated when they should be answered. Were the executive team aware of this backlog? How did it come? And all the usual questions pertaining to that as to why, where, when, etc., Chairman.
So, through your chair, if I start, and Barry may wish to come in relation to this as well. Okay, so the FOI legislation is clear, and while we have been adhering to that legislation, the element that the enforcement notice relates to is because the timescales associated with delivering those FOI responses has been breached. So the standard 20-day response has been exceeded, and this is down to a number of issues which a number of authorities have experienced, but in Shropshire it's been particularly acute in relation to the capacity of staff to be able to pull together responses from across the organisation. So in direct response to the levels of FOI response rate, the failure to meet the deadlines in all cases, I must say, you know, in the majority of cases we are meeting the deadline. What we're not doing is meeting the deadline in all cases. In response to that, we have looked to completely restructure the information governance team and the freedom of information responses and the entire approach and process across the organisation. We have a managers and officers meeting tomorrow in the diary, which is a information governance review meeting, and that the FOI responses form part of that, and the executive directors and senior officers from across the organisation attend that meeting on a regular basis. So the visibility of this is known across the organisation. The enforcement notice was provided by the ICO on the basis of the information that they had at that point in time, and as part of that restructure, that is part of the reason why the post that Barry now holds was created, was to provide an additional level of seniority around focusing on things like information governance and freedom of information responses. So while the approach to date has been suboptimal, we are well on the way to ensuring that we will hit and exceed the timeline in relation to FOI delivery in this current year.
I'll let Roger do this. I'll bring you in then, Rose.
Yeah. There's no reference about the number that is there, how long they've been, and in the introduction it says that the this is open, transparent, etc., all those words in it, but this is just a statement there. It doesn't say how long or why the FOI. Were there any warnings issued first and they were ignored or not? if, as an audit, I think we as a committee need to be aware of what this council is doing and where this council is not reaching the levels that we would want it to reach, I suppose, is the words that may be the best used.
So, yeah, if I hand over to Barry, because there were a number of conversations that I had with the ICO, and we believed that we were managing that in the way that was agreed. However, the enforcement notice was nevertheless provided. But if Barry, if you want to fix that, thank you.
Thank you. It's been a keen focus of mine since I took up my position in April this year. So I have liaised directly with the ICO since then, both by email and I've had a meeting with them and the monitoring officer, and we agreed the action plan, which has been published on our Shropshire Council website, and that plan sets out the measures that we will take to ensure that we're compliant with the legislation. The ICO, during the meeting that we had with them, were comfortable with the actions that we were proposing and the timescales for which that we would implement those actions. And as James referred to earlier on, there is a meeting tomorrow where we will discuss further accelerating that process to ensure that we're following that up.
I think that you better ask this again at the next meeting for an update, Roger.
I think so, Chairman. It would be good at the July meeting. I know it isn't very long, but if there's a meeting tomorrow, if it could be updated then, because as I say, this assurance statement is there and the audit committee is looking at this. So I think I need assurance about what action is being taken.
Okay, well, that will be minuted, Fred. So you can pick it up from the minutes of the next meeting. Rosemary.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Now, I just wanted to check. My understanding of the FOI timescales are that a reply should come back within 20 days, or, if not possible within 20 days, an acknowledgement and a proper timescale that is achievable communicated to the requester. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah. There are a number of elements to a formal freedom of information request, and there are a number of exemptions that can be applied, like say, for example, where we don't hold that information, and we have to communicate that back to the individual who's requested that information. So yeah, you're correct. When a request is received and it is determined that it is a request under the Freedom of Information Act, we should then respond to that within 20 working days.
Yes, come on.
It might be the case that, as we talked about sort of rehabilitating audit within the eyes of staff within the council, that perhaps FOI requests need a bit of rehabilitation in that sense as well. I can imagine that some administrators who are under pressure get an FOI on their desk and think, oh no, and push it to one side, whereas in fact they should grab it with both hands, shouldn't they?
The plan that we've put in place actually deals directly with that issue that you raise, and it is a very important one in terms of how an information request is handled and managed and then responded to within those timeframes. And we're proposing to take a number of measures to get to that point where we're improving that response rate, because clearly it's not good enough.
Elijah.
Yeah, I'm reassured that the annual government statement that the senior officer actually identified the issue. The reality that I think is that that's not open for discussion today, and certainly I'm not sure that it needs within the governor's statement the full, this is what happened, this is how many, this is why. That's not what this statement is about, and I don't necessarily think that now we should be discussing it in detail. It should be about the annual government statement.
I think in fairness, it arises out of issues in the annual government statement. And if the annual government statement is to mean the way in which the whole council operates, the way in which we at the audit committee operate, I think it is legitimate to make the points that have been made by Roger proposing. Even though this was focusing on a particular aspect of the council's government. Right.
Thank you, Chairman. I have a couple of others, but I see the synopsis at the front. The AGS is written as an open, honest reflection of the council's governance challenges. This is a governance challenge, the FOI, that it is somewhere where we need to improve what we are doing. My next one is about peer reviews. They are referred to in various places within this document, but there's nothing there to say what the peer review found. Do we need to be aware of it? Is there anything that we should be aware of it? It's in the different directorates have had peer reviews in it, and there is reference, and then it's just virtually a full stop after it. So were there any, to come back to what I just said, about anything there about the governance challenge that we need to be aware of? And have they been taken care of? And there is another one happening, I think, in the Place Directorate in 2023, looking at, but there are some in the past tense in this document.
James, there's a lot there for you to respond to.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so to confirm, I think everybody is aware there were 3 LGA peer review reviews undertaken last year. One around finance, one around communications, and one around scrutiny. And all 3 of those reports were published on the website, and action plans reported on the website, therefore the whole world to review as they wish to consider. So we've made reference to them within the report, but clearly the report, the agenda is already long enough in terms of the numbers of papers that are attached. So we're not going to attach copies of the LGA review action plans, etc., when they're available on our website.
When you say published on the website, which part of the website are they published on?
So they're put in the newsroom, they're put on the intranet, they're put on the website in relation to the policy side of development, and also on the LGA's website as well.
Yes, I'm just trying to ascertain where a member of the public would find these.
Most people find these by just Googling, if I'm honest. If you just want to look for an LGA review, that's where you would find it. But or you go to the LGA website, or within Shropshire Council's website, you look on the newsroom. The finance peer review, for example, was published there on the 12th of June.
Roger again.
Thank you, Chairman. There is a reference in it, for example, on page 38 about the People Directorate having a peer review looking at the finance. So that's the People Directorate doing it, not the overall finance one. And it's just made that statement. I presume that's different to the one that was just referred to. And it just says a peer review was carried out looking at the finance on that directorate, specifically at that directorate. But is there any governance there that we need to consider?
If I may, Chair, sorry, what I did miss out in my previous response was that in an example of the finance peer review, we did ask them to consider governance arrangements across the authority, and they did. And this was the original report published last year. There was endorsement in relation to our governance arrangements. In relation to the peer review that was undertaken within the People's Directorate, this was very specific and from memory related to a benchmarking review of children's services costs. So it was very much it was a peer review in that there were there's another authority involved in terms of who provided the individual, but it was basically a benchmarking exercise around the financial position and cost within children's services. So were there any governance issues? None that I can recall. But again, I didn't publish that one, but I would have assumed that is on the website. I haven't looked myself, but I'd imagine it would be on the website. If it isn't, there's no reason why.
In view of the Thurrock report, which has been in the media in the last week, I actually spent some time looking at this because the Thurrock councillors there were found at fault. They did not ask the questions that they should have asked of the council, and there's a best value review of 110 pages that the Essex County Council gave on the Thurrock Council there, and it is really condemning that council and the performance of what had happened. So it's in that view is where I'm asking these questions from. I see on page 44, it mentions the LED lights to be finished in March 24, but elsewhere in the document, it says October 23. They can't both be correct. One, it may be an aim or one is a target, but it is there. And on page 49, it refers under the audit committee to the LJC. LJC ceased to exist some time ago. We deleted them. And there's things like this in the report, I feel, gives some thought about how carefully it's been put together. Now, maybe a little bit blunt, but it needs to be challenged because it's an open governance statement of this council. And it's mentioning things like that, which seem to differ in different parts. There are three periods. I'll leave it at that, Chairman.
Well, you're certainly challenging, Roger. There's no doubt about it. I imagine that the Essex report was an excellent bedtime reading. And you may well have fallen asleep before you reached the end of it. Simon?
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on what Roger was saying. Sorry? No, still had big floors. Follow up on what Roger was saying. Absolutely, right on the LJC. And of course, when you get little gremlins going in like that, it does sort of it doesn't enhance the rest of the report. And moving up to page 41, we talk about fix my street. I think the view is that it's a done. Everything is okay with fix my street. And I do feel it is absolutely a work in progress. So I think that should be reflected in the report. And I'll just touch on a couple of others, very generics here, which I'd just like a bit of fleshing out. The idea, this is on page 20, that the council strive to, the words are, ensure all stakeholders are safely recovered from COVID, and then we've had happy staff. How is all that measured? It's great things to say, but I don't even know what it really means in sort of the cold reality of light. And finally, on page 23, I'm concerned that staff are no longer appraised. They seem to have shifted to individual personal development programs or plans. And does that mean that we've given up appraising our staff in the council? And if that is the case, how do we ever help them improve, or if they just simply cannot improve, ease them out?
Yes, James.
Right, so there's a lot to go up there.
No,
Sorry, not just being used, Simon, is also just picking up some of Roger's points. So if I miss anything, please come back and remind me. First of all, apologies in relation to the governance framework that's in there. We did go through and update that and add a couple of things in. But the majority of it's been a standard statement that's been there for a number of years. So that LJC has been missed by officers and clearly members ever since that the LJCs were removed, because that bit hasn't been removed for several years.
Actually, James, it was mentioned last year.
Oh, was it mentioned last year?
I recall exactly the same debate last year.
It was.
If it was, right, okay. In that case, I can only apologise again. Barry, if you just make a specific note to remove that from
Retrospectively,
twice
in relation to that. So yeah, I can only apologise for that. But it's a standard statement that that gets reviewed on that basis. Sorry, my screens have all just gone blank, which is not helpful. Certainly not going to try to remember everything that was raised. Just bear with me 2 seconds. So in relation to the points that were made around, so back to, I'm going to get back to page 20, you raised in relation to that. Oh yeah, so in terms of the outcomes that have been identified there, we are, and this moves us into the transformation and improvement scrutiny, overview and scrutiny committee element. But examples for staff are healthy and happy. We're putting together a performance management framework, which is basically a set of indicators across the authority that work their way up through to giving us overall assurance and overall performance management information in relation to the Shropshire plan and the healthy priorities within that and the strategic objectives. One of the strategic objectives is around basically a happy and healthy workforce. That's one of the elements that are there. So in terms of measuring that, we look at things like sickness statistics to see whether there are elements in relation to stress, etc. We also will be undertaking regular staff surveys across the organisation to get a kind of a pulse survey in relation to how staff are feeling, and then that allows us to then manage that and deal with that information as it comes through. Ideally, we would be looking to be doing those surveys initially annually, but we're thinking probably more regular than that. Maybe even quarterly, but don't hold me to that because we haven't worked that one through in completeness yet. In relation to staff appraisals and PDPs, what we've ditched is the word appraisals. And we've replaced that with personal development plans because it's much more focused on exactly the points that you're talking about. It's where are the development issues? It's not just an appraisal of how you've done the last 12 months. It's really about that obviously is done. And as part of that process, it's then about understanding what development needs are therefore necessary to resolve whatever that appraisal has told us. Either to improve, to deal with any particular issues, etc. So the Get Leadership Right programme, which has involved the top 250 members of the organisation, or officers of the organisation. The focus of that has been about setting that golden thread through the organisation and creating a new personal development appraisal process that is then being implemented and rolled out across the authority. So if you've got 250 managers who are all aware of this new approach, some of those will be appraising others that are on that development plan, but also that will then cascade its way down to the authority. And we are now, as those personal development plans are being completed, they are being recorded in the ERP so that we have information in relation to making sure that all of those are being completed and done.
So can I ask then, that in that case, are you saying there is no, if you like, judgment on the previous year's performance?
No, exactly the opposite. That's what I'm saying. So there is a consideration.
So can you fail to
Sorry?
achieve your goals in one particular year?
Yes.
And there can be consequences for that.
And that's where the development plan comes from. The consequences. So you review the last 12 months, and there is an extensive series of questions and documentation. However, the appraisal process is not the point where you pick up problems. The way in which this should be dealt with is, if there are particular problems, it's the capability or the disciplinary process. That's the way that's worked through. But an appraisal of the last 12 months with no surprises is undertaken, and from that, the development plan. So, for example, were there capability issues that then led to, say, a warning? That would then be picked up and discussed within the development plan, and the plan would then be how do you make sure that doesn't happen again, for example. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Rosemary.
It's just a sort of minor comment. Thanks for that, James. I think that appraisal was a misnomer because appraisals always included these elements that you're talking about, really, didn't they? And I'm sure they're much more sophisticated than they were 10 or 20 years ago. But I think it's a broader exercise, and I think that what you're calling it now is more reflective of what it really is than simply an appraisal.
Yeah, and if I may, Chair, just in relation to that, There is a lot of not changing the language for the sake of it, but trying to inject a new kind of motivation and enthusiasm through the organisation. So an appraisal is something that has been, people have experience of, and sometimes that's quite negative. So if we bring in a completely new approach, title it something different, then that helps us to embed something new and different.
Well, proof the pudding will be in the eating.
Correct.
Members, you have given officers very much to think about, and it is right that you do.
Last one, Chairman, if I may. And it's on the action plan update, which is Appendix C. A note, and there doesn't appear to be anything in the report that I can see, on page 51, development and delivery of early intervention strategy, completion date September 22. So it's within this, and it now says it's going to be September of this year, 1 year late. There's no reference in the document that I can remember reading about the delay and the reasons for it. And also, I note that on page 53, the council has problems this year, which we're all aware of. And under 7, it says deliver projects that achieve savings targets. Target was November 22, and it says that May, June 23, it will be achieved, I think, or appointment of officers in place. But it's those two mentions there of completion dates, which isn't really picked up within the assurance report itself that I can remember reading.
If I may, Chair. So so this is the review of the 21-22 position. So in terms of ensuring that we cover off all the areas, we ask each of the executive directors to provide us with their own management assurance around those particular areas and whether those things have been achieved or not, or been carried forward or not. In the interest of trying to keep the whole report reasonably readable, we don't go into great detail in relation to those. We just ask for that level of assurance, and it is only management assurance from the executive directors in relation to that. If there is anything as part of that which audit committee feel that they want further assurance on, then that can be raised as has been done today. From that, we can either ask that question and bring a follow-up response, or it's always in the powers of the audit committee to ask for further information or a further report, or to ask somebody to come to the meeting to discuss it in more detail. So I think I don't have the answers to the particular points that have been raised because I haven't provided the assurance. So what I would ask is for a judgment to be made by the audit committee as to what you therefore want to do with those two questions that have been raised.
Through you, Chairman, I can understand it is specific to the directorate, but I would ask that, yes, as part of the assurance report and looking at it, it would be useful to have an update at an appropriate time this year of how we're going and where we are, because some of those do have repercussions into this year and how the council both governs and the governance, but also achieves its targets that we need to achieve.
Well, I could agree. Actually, that ties in with one point that I wish to make. If we take, if I may take you to page 43 of our papers, it's page 21 of the governance issue. It's an appendix without a name to it. It's not an A, B, or C. It's an appendix that says significant government issues for 22-23. The completion date, if you look, contains a number which are due for completion in June, and I would hope that we can have an update on whether those have been completed in time, or whether the other issues are proceeding in timely fashion to be completed on the dates they say, July 23, November 23, and so on. So I would wish to have an update on progress on these governance issues for the September meeting. I think we've enough on the June agenda, and I would hope that we could respond to Roger's additional issues on governance at that September meeting. I think the September meeting would be an appropriate one to give time for this to be dealt with. Would you agree, Roger?
Yes, Chairman. As I said, at the appropriate time, because it may need to, and it would be good to have it, what it is and where we are, because I also picked up those comments that you've just made in it, that June 23 seems to be a significant date. And if one looks at the peer challenge review that the director referred to right at the start, it says that by June 23, the council should be aware of whether it's going to achieve the target savings that are going to be needed for this year. So I think it's important that we do look at June 23. It is a significant month.
Sorry, I don't think we will know the direction of travel of all these significant governance issues in a month's time.
Yeah.
I think by September, our meeting in September, we shall have a much better idea where we are. So if we commit it, that we will be looking as a committee for an update on government issues and the progress of various government issues by September, I shall be grateful. If there are no other queries, may we receive and endorse the annual government statement? All happy with that? You may be a bit bemused by all this, Jim. It will take you 2 or 3 meetings to get the feel of the way the committee works and to have the background to just what we do. So I hope, I'm sure you're listening very carefully.
I am indeed.
And it's obviously difficult to make any response to something that you haven't been immersed in previously. So
there is a lot of new terminology and
that's right.
acronyms I'm not familiar with, and but yes, it is interesting, and yeah.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, you're here for another. I hope you're here for a number of years, and perhaps after 2 or 3 meetings, you will feel a lot more confident about being able to join in the issues with some knowledge of background.
I do have a couple of observations, Chair, which maybe I'll make at the end because they'll probably be maybe addressed.
No, not on this particular report.
I just made them as I went through.
Well, I think in that case, let us just hold the resolution we've made and hear your observations there.
Well, I think the one was about the decline in the audit completion. I don't know what section that was in, and next time I apologise. I'll make sure my comments are addressed to the relevant sections you're discussing. And the audit completion rates dropped to 64% from 70 something. Clearly, if that trend were to continue, that would be a risk within the organisation. And attached to that was the under-resourced audit team. Did I read that correctly? We were missing people, trying to hire people, and that too would be a risk in terms of audit and governance if that group was not fully staffed. So I'm trying to associate the 2 things together. I don't know if they are. I guess they are to a degree. That was just an observation that I made as I read through it, and a similar comment around the budget challenges of 23-24. 50 million pounds worth of savings. I mean, only 15 million were achieved in the prior financial year. Seems a very tall order. And I don't know the consequences of not achieving that 51 million pounds worth of savings. However, if it applies undue stress on or consequences on individuals, they may be tempted to take inappropriate behaviour, which would then could potentially be a governance issue. I don't know if there is.
I think those are very valid points. I
apologise if I've got them in the wrong place in the agenda, but those are some of the observations.
don't think that by any means they're in the wrong place of the agenda because they reflect on governance matters. Barry, you want to have a word on that?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Chair.
I apologise for not.
Thanks for raising those points, Jim. And in the July Audit Committee, there'll be 2 reports going to that meeting from an internal audit perspective. One is the internal audit performance for the final quarter. The second will be the annual opinion report. And that annual opinion report will cover the entirety of the 2022-23 financial year internal audit provision work, and that will include the statistics, number of jobs, the recommendations that have been made as part of that work. So you'll have a more in-depth report to the July Audit Committee, and you'll be able to see where the resources have gone. In terms of the team, during 2022-23, the former head of internal audit retired in September. There were a number of staff changes. We also had a principal auditor who moved positions within the council. So there's been some movement within the team, and there are some vacancies within the team that we're looking to address in the current financial year in 23-24.
Thank you, Barry. I think I can say it's not easy to recruit experienced and competent auditors. The whole world is looking, the whole financial world is looking for such people, including our external auditors who are well behind with much of their work, mainly because it's difficult to recruit good quality, competent audit staff. So
thank you, Chair. And that probably reminded me of another comment about the 2 years accounts that have yet to be signed off.
We're coming to that in due course. Right, well, we have resolved to approve and to accept the report. So we'll now move on to our item 7, the financial outturn report. Starts on page 57 of my documentation. The financial outturn report. James Walton's name is attached to it, so I call upon James to introduce it.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the outturn report, which was taken to Cabinet on the 7th of June. It's here today and will go on to full council in early July. So the reason this report is brought to Audit Committee is, again, as alongside the AGS and the statement of accounts, it provides a full suite of information around the financial position and the overall assurance that can be taken in relation to the last financial year's account. So the outturn report is different to the statement of accounts in that it follows the format of the quarterly monitoring reports that go through to Cabinet. So each quarter, quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, there is an estimation of the potential outturn position for that financial year, and then quarter 4, when you get to the end of the financial year, the financial outturn report is produced. So what's important in relation to this is scrutiny also consider the monitoring position, and it's at the scrutiny committees where challenge scrutiny in relation to unders and overspends is undertaken. Here, the purpose of the outturn report is really to give that overview in relation to the financial stability and governance of the financial process. So the headline is clearly that Shropshire Council overspent by £8.5 million by the end of the financial year. Now, this was a small improvement in relation to what was being projected in the previous quarter. However, it's not significantly different, and it's not significantly different from quarter 2 or quarter 1 projected outturn positions. So while the number, £8.5 million overspend, is not ideal, nevertheless, the underlying control framework suggesting that an estimate, and there was a control corridor drawn together at the start of the year, but the best estimate was around the £10 to £11 million overspend position. The fact that that is pretty much where we came out at the end of the year, does demonstrate that we have a much greater and stronger grip in relation to our projections of the council's financial position, and that is helpful, picking up from Jim Arnold's point around the savings plan for 23-24. That provides some assurance to the committee in relation to the estimates that we are now able to make are based on a solid foundation. In terms of the report itself, it identifies where there are unders and overspends. Again, even down to individual directorate levels, the levels of variance have not changed significantly over the year. The difference between this and last year and previous years has very much been about let's look at what we believe that final position will be after mitigations, both positive and negative, in relation to the proposed estimates. Previously, it was this is the situation as it is now, if nothing changes, and we will implement action to make those changes. So now this takes account of those changes much earlier in the process, which I believe shows stronger governance around the approach. All of the information in relation to the individual variances, the overarching position in relation to how those are broken down in terms of where are the controllable movements, non-controllable movements, where are the pressures, the savings, etc., is all shown in detail in the appendices to the report, so that an overarching view can be taken, and the levels of reserves held across the authority in different elements are also shown as well. And again, just to address a point that was raised earlier, where we have an overspending situation, what happens in relation to that? The only place that we can go if we have an overspending situation is to use the reserves of the authority to cover that off. What we can't do is have an overspend at the end of the year, which then leaves us with effectively a negative balance sheet in that sense. So we would use reserves as it was. That the overspend in 22-23 depleted the reserves significantly. The point that I would make, however, is that is the position as at the 31st of March 2023. On the 1st of April 2023, the new budget kicks in, and as part of that new budget, there was an inbuilt allocation to the general fund balance. So therefore, the £4 million that was left on the 31st of March became 23 million the day later. So we have more resilience going into the 23-24 financial position budget than would appear by just looking at the outturn report 22-23. I hope that makes sense, but I have taken the questions on any of that difference.
Yeah, if I could just bring one point in. Jim asked, what were the consequences if we didn't manage to find the 51 million to reach a balanced budget? I think all our members are aware of the answer to that and fear the consequences. But you might like to respond to Jim's benefit to that question.
Yeah. So there are approaches that are undertaken, built into statute in relation to what happens in those sorts of situations. So starting point is we need to set a balanced budget. So the 23-24 financial position, we have to take appropriate estimates of our income and expenditure and the resources that are available to us and produce a budget. Initially, for most authorities, that starts with a funding gap, and then that funding gap needs to be closed down to zero through a spending reduction programme or an income increase process. So that is approved by council. It was approved by council this year on the 2nd of March. Alongside that statement was a robustness of estimates and adequacy of reserves statement from myself, 151 officer. So that sets out the basis on which the estimates have been pulled together and whether the reserve position is adequate given those estimates in that position. So that's your starting point. What you then do is you monitor that as the year goes through, and the tipping point effectively is is the level of overspend containable within the level of reserves that are there? So ideally, you don't have an overspend, you have an underspend, or you have a balance. And if there is an overspend, and let's say on the 1st of April, there was an overspend of £51 million, and the reserves level was at £23 million. Well, clearly, that's an issue. However, that is not a projection at that point in time. The projections are being produced now rather than on a quarterly basis, on a monthly basis. So we've just come to the end of the projections for the period 2. And from that, we will then be able to assess whether the level of projected overspend is contained within the level of reserves. If there is an imbalance between those two, then action will be undertaken to bring it in within that level. There is a process much further down the line whereby specific powers can be provided to effectively stop all discretionary spend at a point in time. There's all sorts of elements in relation to that, which would be implemented or could be implemented should that position not be resolved to the management action taken through. But as I mentioned before, local authorities can't go lost, so there has to be a plan that brings it in one way or another.
I think what you haven't quite taken forward to is the point where an authority, and there have been some authorities who know, have not achieved a balanced budget, have not been able. If in theory we were ended up 51 million out of kilter at the end of the year, what does the government do about it?
Before the government do anything, the local authority could issue a Section 114 notice. At this point, as I say, a board is pulled together and all discretionary spend is considered, and effectively, in other authorities, they have then stopped expenditure through that. In some extreme cases, that's not been sufficient. So what government can do is effectively send in multiple commissioners. Those commissioners can then basically take over control of the authority and take over those expenditure plans. What can also happen is, as I mentioned earlier, there are special powers that can be provided. For example, capital, which cannot be used for revenue purposes. A power can be provided to use capital for revenue purposes. That could mean the sale of assets, which then are used to temporarily shore up the budget. There are opportunities, there's a referendum limit on council tax increases. There is an opportunity to increase the council tax above that referendum level. And again, we've seen examples of that over the last 12 months, whereby alternative action is taken by the government. Effectively, in its extreme, it's taking control away from the local authority to bring the budget back into balance. That's extreme, isn't seen in many cases, and certainly not something that we're considering or discussing in Shropshire.
Thanks for that. Well, members, the financial action report is before you. Roger has at least one comment to make.
Thank you, Chairman. I note this is going to council anyway, so a lot of the comments can be made there. But looking at this as a member of the audit committee, I do note that in 4.5 on page 61, it says to ensure financial sustainability in future years and overspend on the scale seen in the last financial year cannot be accommodated. But my understanding is of the £51 million, a good part of that is a contribution to general reserves of over £20 million to go into general reserves. Is how I read this. So it's contemplated that the reserve should be built up during this coming year, and that's included in the £51 million savings. So there is a little bit of there. But questions I've really got, Chairman, are on the housing revenue account. The comment there about the substantial reserves that are held there, is there any comment? And also on page 81, there's a £1.965 million, which should have been saved last year, has been added to the £51 million for this year. Is that correct? And I'm trying to concentrate on last year's accounts than what we're talking about this year. So they are factual ones. Have that debate in a fortnight's time.
Well, you want to be well briefed for that debate, Roger, I'm sure. Right, yes.
So just in relation to those 2 points, so just to be clear, the £51 million savings is base budget savings. So that is a base budget reduction. That's not about transferring money into reserves. That's about reducing the base budget expenditure. There is a number of elements that are being transferred into reserves. That's all part of the mix. But fundamentally, the budget was built up around a plan which was based on an assumption, a set of assumptions around government funding. Therefore, any increase in that government funding that came through, that's the bit that would then be thrown into reserves. So it's a slightly different equation to what was just quoted there. In relation to the 1.965 million, so these are the savings that are delivered, that are rated as red, and value and budget allocated.
They are on page 81 of the report before us today, Chairman.
That's right, yeah. So what we've got is a calculation of the unachieved savings which are being carried forward into the 23-24. So in terms of the £51 million, then yes, effectively that would be within that overall total. So an assessment has been made in looking at the position for 23-24 and those savings that were achieved in 22-23 and those that weren't achieved in 22-23. Of those that weren't achieved, the question is that timing issue, or is that the market has moved, or there is a change in approach? If there is a change, then those will be discounted, in which case the problem becomes slightly bigger in 23-24. If they are still achievable, but it's perhaps, for example, a timing issue, then you would say, well, that's still valid, and that would be included in the following year. And all of that, because what we don't want to do is lose any of this, all of that has been amalgamated into one big list, which is what officers have taken from.
Yes, Simon.
Yeah, I mean, just a small one. Page 61, 4.6. I assume there's only one chief officer, not officers. So I'm just right. That's picky, but
You want to delete the S at the
I
end?
do. Yeah. Well, unless I've misunderstood how many Andy Biglets we've got. But...
No, sorry, if I may share, there is one chief executive, but there is a. It's basically around scales. You have scaled officers and chief officers. It's historic. So there's chief officers. There's considerable number of those. Considerably more than one.
More than one. That's fine. That's. Thank you. Secondly, probably more important, we talk about at page 59 the capital programme slipping. So therefore, there's been a saving in interest. We would or have borrowed for those capital projects. What are they, and are they likely, these capital projects, to be resurrected or continued into 23-24 financial year?
May Chair. So yes, the capital programme is set out, and there are a series of projects that are due to be delivered in the year, and all this basically is often capital projects do take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years to deliver. What we do at the start of the year is make an assumption about how far that will progress from a financial point of view. And if we assume that £3 million will be spent in the year, and then because of a delay in planning permission or whatever, only £2 million was spent, then obviously that would be slippage. What that basically means is that we build a treasury strategy and a capital strategy around assumptions of how that will be delivered. So using that example, if we assumed that £3 million would be spent in this year, and that was all to be funded from borrowing, then we would build in an assumption that £3 million will be borrowed, and MRP will be, minimum revenue provision, will be required in the revenue account to pay for that borrowing in the future years. If, however, you're only spending £2 million in that example, then you'd only need to borrow £2 million, not £3 million, if it was that direct. Now, the reality is it's not that direct. You're not borrowing constantly as you're spending money. What you're doing is you're looking at your overall cash position, and within that cash position, there'll be historic debt. So, for example, for the last 4 or 5 years, loans have been paid off. So there's a loan due sometime this month, which is I think about £4 or £5 million. That's one that was set back in the 90s and is now being paid off. The question we ask ourselves is, do we now, say it's £5 million, for example, does our cash flow require us to borrow that £5 million now or not? So what we've gone through is a period where we've had a really high cash balance and there's been no need to borrow. Now, even though borrowing rates have been low, you still don't want to borrow and you don't need the money because you're paying interest unnecessarily. As we're moving forward, if the capital programme gets delivered in line with the assumptions and we look at our cash balance, there will be a need to borrow in the future. But all of those capital programmes, just because there's been slippage, doesn't change the programme, because it might be a 5-year programme. It just means that something that was supposed to be delivered in year 2 has now slipped into year 3. But there's no change. The only overall change that would be made would be if the overall programme was proposed to cost £5 million, it's now going to cost 7. We would have to go back to council to get the approval for that additional expenditure.
Okay, thank you. That's it's an ALCO thing. So just very one, page 85, Shire Services appear to have struggled to repay to the general reserve. Is that? I mean, the amounts are immaterial. I'm not even sure what Shire Services actually are, let alone why they can't repay back into the general reserve.
Again, if I may chair, so Shire Services is the council arm that delivers basic cleaning and cooking services, mainly to schools in Shropshire and in other parts of the country as well. There was an assumption that basically the way that Shire Services works is they have a trading account, so they're effectively due to balance to zero in any year. So not making a surplus, not making a deficit, basically balancing off. If they make a deficit in 1 year, then they need to make a surplus in later years to repay that. So it balances to zero over a longer period of time. What this is demonstrating is that there is a deficit position, which is then, again, as with everything else, it has to come from somewhere. So what we do is we charge that to the general fund, and it sits there as a reserve that is due to be repaid by Shire Services by increasing their fees or reducing their costs or whatever it might be to bring that back into balance over a longer period of time.
I have a couple of points. If I may take the committee back to page 61, which is page 5 of this report. Reverting to the capital programme, as an aside, I can say, in 20 years with this authority and many years as a member of, before that, of other authorities, I have never known an authority complete 100% of its capital programme in the year. There is always slippage. It would be a remarkable situation if any local authority managed to achieve 100% of its capital programme. Now, if we look at paragraph C on this page, an additional more detailed review is planned for the summer of 2023 to accommodate the latest information on all capital schemes and proposals. When is this to be published?
Thank you, Chair. So this has been discussed quite extensively at the Transformation and Improvement Overview and Scrutiny Committee. And my recollection is that a briefing has been prepared and then task and fringe groups are being set up over the summer to consider the capital strategy, and that's where the review of all those capital schemes will be undertaken, due to report back I think it's October, November time.
Oh, much later in the year then.
Yeah, that's where, because ultimately it has to go to council for approval, and that isn't until March 24. However, there is an opportunity to approve that by council early in the year if that review is significant enough to warrant.
Well, even if it's not approved, it would be interesting to be able to note the review and see what the consequences of the review are.
So again, if I may chair, the Result of that review will be reported to the Transformation Improvement Overview and Scrutiny Committee, which all members are able to access the papers and are able to attend as guests if they wish to.
Thank you. And the other rather more minor point, paragraph 4, 6 below. F, update training in financial management, which is a slightly invites curiosity. Who needs updating in financial management? Is that financial staff themselves, or for whom is this intended, and how will it be done?
Thank you, Chair. So this is a suite of issues that have been pulled together, listed A2F in paragraph 4.6, around how we help to provide assurance around delivery of the savings plan in this year. And so we do have training in place in relation to financial management for budget holders. So the budget of the authority is divided up into individual budget holders that have control and responsibility for those individual budgets. What we're doing is updating and training as part of the Financial Management Improvement Programme to ensure that all budget holders are sufficiently aware and understanding of financial management issues, and that's particularly important in a year where spending reductions to the level are having to be implemented. So in a sense it's belt and braces, in another sense it's an absolute essential element, because we will catch people as part of that that need additional help and support in managing their budget this year.
I would hope that most officers would have been aware of financial management before they became budget holders. But it's good to know that they are to be updated. Thank you for that. Right, the financial outturn report is before us. Shall we note it, members? And you'll hear more about this council on the 6th of July. Do we need a break? Anybody want a break, or shall we? Right, we'll have a 5-minute break before we go on to statements of the council.
But on the screen, you can see that Charles Sedgley is with us, and hiding behind an NH badge is Nikki Higgins, who is also there at the moment. Oh, there she is. Those are the two accountants within the authority who have produced this several 100-page report, statement of accounts for us to consider today. So, as a kind of a brief introduction, just to give a little bit of flavour to what it's there for. Oh, and we do have Neil Stewart as well, who's hiding behind the NS badge. I didn't pick up on that, sorry. So Neil Stewart and Nikki Higgins both work to Cheryl, who is our chief accountant, basically. Sorry, I should have mentioned Neil. The three of them there pulled that information together. So the statement of accounts itself. So this is the accounts that we produce for the local authority for 22-23. So as you would expect, in a set of accounts, you'd see a profit and loss account and a balance sheet. There are considerably more elements to that our statement of accounts than those two basic documents. But I'll go through those in a second. You'll see in the executive summary, which is in section 2 of the report, which starts on the top of page 104. We've got a table there which sets out the deadlines that we are working to. So our financial year ends 31st of March. What we then do is produce a draft set of accounts, and basically this set of accounts has been presented today. They're produced by the team, and then I'm required effectively to sign those off as at the 31st of May, and then those get published as our draft set of accounts on the website. That then allows anybody to review and consider, and if they wish to raise questions or even potentially raise an objection to the account should they wish. The excellent news, and I can't really overplay this, is the team did achieve that deadline by the 31st of May 2023, and that is out of line with lots of local authorities across the country. And in the meetings that I've had with treasurers groups, unitary and county treasurers groups over the last few weeks, a bit of a straw poll suggested that the majority of authorities have not been able to complete their draft set of accounts by the 31st of May. That has an impact on the staff because they're basically working for a longer period of time on trying to produce something. So the fact that the team have pulled that out of the bag and been able to produce it by the 1st of May, we should be celebrating, but also it does allow them a little bit of a break, if I can use that word, without everybody frowning too much at me, in terms of the next step of the accounts. The external audit is due to be carried out between the 19th of June to be completed by the 30th of September, and the statutory deadline for which the accounts to be published and audited is the 30th of September. So we're planning around that, and we will have an audit committee meeting to review those audited statement of accounts in place. And so let's say that's the date that we are working through at the moment. So the outturn report identified an overspend of 8.5 million in the previous document. What we then have is a statement within section 5.2, which just demonstrates how the values in terms of the controllable outturn are reported in the statement of accounts in relation to that net cost of services. In section 8, in fact, in paragraph 8.3, it sets out the main elements of the statement of accounts, the narrative report, statement of responsibilities, and then the audit opinion and certificate. That's the bit that will come back when the audit has been completed. We then have the core financial statements. So we have the movement and reserves, we have the comprehensive income and expenditure account, that's basically the profit and loss, balance sheet, and then on top of that, cash flow, notes and statements, and then things like the group accounts and the collection fund and the pension fund accounts. Pension fund accounts form part of the pension fund annual statement, and that will be considered separately by the pensions committee in a meeting tomorrow. But all of that is consolidated within the local authorities accounts, for the statement of accounts that are produced. So Appendix 1 is the actual statement of accounts, and then Appendix 2 provides the analytical review. So this is a review of all of the lines in the accounts compared with the 21-22, 22-23, and where there is a variance of over £8 million or over 10%, then that is picked up and highlighted, and an explanation is provided so that those obvious questions that we would expect members to pick up on, why has this changed so much within a space of 12 months? There is an explanation there, and that therefore provides the basis on which members can consider the accounts. So I'll stop there. What I will say is welcome any questions that you have, and as I usually say at this point in the meeting, so I'm happy to take any questions, and I will then direct them to Cheryl, Nikki and Neil to answer them if I'm unable to, which is highly likely.
Thank you, James. I think that as a committee, we would be glad, or pleased, to congratulate the team on managing to provide the accounts within 2 months of the end of the financial year. I can imagine that it was an enormous job demanding quite a lot of very long hours. And I think that as one of the authorities, and there aren't that many, I understand, who have managed to meet the deadline, we can be very proud of the financial team that we have here in that regard. So well done, team, for that. Now then, the draft statement of accounts are before us, members. Roger?
Thank you, Chairman. And it's a question, if I can, and that on page 104 in 2.3, it says the earmarked reserves provisions decreased by 31. Okay, I've not got a query with that. On page 127, under reserves, it says earmarked reserves have decreased by 37.05 million. My interpretation of that 37 is that included in that is the schools increase, which is referred to, but it also includes the general fund balance has decreased as well. And it's marrying up those two figures. In that one, it definitely says the earmarked reserves, whereas in 2.3, the earmarked reserves is a different sum. And I think it's just wording, whichever is felt needed. Have I interpreted that correctly?
So I mean, I'll happily hand over to Cheryl, Nikki. I mean, my immediate interpretation was it talks about earmarks, reserves and provisions as changing by 32 million pounds, whereas the separate page talks about just reserves. Is that the correct interpretation?
Yeah, I was going to say that on the report in 2.3, we do refer to reserves and provisions. That includes things like bad debt provisions and any other provisions that we have to make during the course of the year. So that's the difference between the two figures. In the accounts, we're referring specifically just to reserves, so either earmarked reserves, and then we refer separately to the movement that's happened on the general fund balance. But that is the specific difference, yeah.
I'll rework the figures.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Simon?
No, Rosie, right.
Okay, yeah. Mine was about the various funds in Appendix 2, really, that are noted to decrease following the removal of the COVID uplifts.
Sorry, which section are you referring to?
Sorry, Appendix 2.
First bit you said.
So, hold on. So, about the, well, it's just on page 112. Just trying to. And I think from a little earlier as well.
So you're talking about the middle one, taxation and non-specific grant income?
So for example, specifically starting with looking at health, so that is actually page 110. So it's that section in Appendix 2. It's a general question relating to those decreased funds. Obviously, I can go back into history to have a look at these in detail, but I'm sure you know the answer. thinking of these are all decreased because of the removal of the COVID uplifts in these specific areas, but do they reflect an incremental, so taking away the COVID period, do they reflect an incremental, is there an increment in those grants based, say, on 2019, 2018, 19, or is there actually a reduction in, let's call it real terms, based on the sort of pre-COVID period?
So, if I share, the answer to that will probably vary. What happened was COVID funding was provided for specific purposes over a period of time, and what it did, and this is what is coming out in a number of authorities across the country, is the COVID grant was provided on a basis, but actually wasn't ring-fenced. So what happened was you had a budget that was sat here, you had a whole series of pressures that were underneath it, and providing your pressures overall added up to the amount that was provided, you just got on with it. So what that did was, it then meant when you take that away, you suddenly then re-exposed the underlying issue. And exactly as I think you're getting to, some areas will have shifted incrementally in a direction which was perhaps not as visible, given the COVID funding and the uncertainty about how long the pandemic would continue, and also how long the funding would continue. So what that then brings us into is the budget setting process, whereby you look at those individual service areas or interventions or whatever they may be, and as part of that you would then say, we need to build growth into this particular area because actually that's shifted in a different way that's been hidden. In terms of the grants themselves, they varied year on year. So in some years, in early days, there was quite a large chunk of funding, I think in the region of about 20 million that came in quite early. And then there were different sets of allocations and funding for different purposes as that moved on. So it's difficult to say, did the level of funding change? Because there were different grants effectively. The overall sum, though, did go down over that period, and now it's effectively been removed altogether. Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
Yeah, I've got a couple actually, so straight on with it. Page 149, looking at the cash flow. Sorry. So 149, we're looking at the cash flow. And the cash flow at the end of the period from 21-22 was dropped from 27 million to about 6 million. Should we be concerned that at one stage we would appear to be getting pretty close to a negative there?
Sorry, my power went off as you were starting out. What was which line were we referring to? Because I can't see.
It's the cash flow statement on page 149.
Oh, okay, and the reduction in the cash flow levels.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's at year end, so it's a moment in time.
Yes.
But 6 million does strike me as getting pretty close to the
so
we're in debt.
If I may share, there's two parts to this. One is the cash flow statement, and one is the cash for the authority. The cash flow statement, I'll let you into a secret, it's Vicky Hean's favourite statement in the entire statement of accounts, so she'll be able to tell you in great detail about how that particular issue is pulled together. In terms of the overall cash position of the authority, we are seeing that reduce. We are seeing that, and it's going back to the points that I mentioned before in relation to we've got debt that's being repaid, that's not being replaced. We've got grants that have reduced. So just talk about the COVID grants. If they're not coming in anymore, that reduces our cash flow position. So all of that is taken into account in the overarching position. Our cash balances are still around the £100 million level. So are we concerned about that cash balance in practical terms? No. But in terms of, I can't get it up at the moment, but in terms of the specific statement, I'll hand over to Cheryl or Nikki, who will provide you a bit more of an explanation in relation to the specific question you're asking, I hope.
Well, we wouldn't want to deprive Cheryl of talking to us about her favourite part of the financial statements. The floor is yours, Cheryl.
Thank you, Chair. It's Nikki's favourite, to be honest. But Yeah, in terms of the cash flow statement, that purely looks at cash and cash equivalents and the movement during the course of the year. What we also have, which is held elsewhere in the balance sheet, is short-term investments, and technically that is cash that we hold, and that's money that we've got invested over a longer period of time, that we're achieving interest on. So yeah, while the cash figure has reduced during the course of the year, we have also got, as I say, another balance as well. So it isn't as low as that might actually look in terms of the cash figure.
Yeah,
Nick, is
completely understand that. But thank you. I've just we've got one more. It's the amount of debt, the borrowing. I think it's on page 203, and it's good to see that it's dropped from 521 million to 491 million, if I've got that correct. Can I just ask where it was, say, 3-4 years ago? Is this a declining trajectory, which I would suggest is a good thing at the moment with increased interest rates, or is this sort of a blip?
Yeah. So levels of borrowing have generally fallen. The only borrowing that I can remember that we've undertaken in the last sort of decade would be the HRA. I think it was about 84 million pounds, something like that, we borrowed for the HRA. What this figure also includes is things like PFI and finance leases. So there's elements of it, not just around the borrowing element, but we have not borrowed for general fund purposes. I think it's probably around about a decade now, maybe probably a bit longer than that. So this is about managing the overall cash flow of the organisation. So again, as we talked earlier around the capital programme, it's a complicated area because what you have, you've literally got council tax coming in on a daily basis, and salaries going out on a the 20th of the month, and you've got things like that are happening. You've got paid and parking income that's coming in, and all of that is managed on a kind of quite a micro basis. What you've then got is the macro side of it. So you've got loans being repaid for the organisation. You've got huge levels of grant that could be coming in at any different points in the year. You've got preset payments that are being made to the fire authority and police authority. You've got things like DSG grants coming in and being passed out to schools. And you've got things like reserves, Section 106, SIL, high levels of income that are sat there in the account. All of that needs to be taken into account in terms of that management. So the borrowing decision is based around all of those elements taken into account. We have a Treasury advisor, and they give an overview on a monthly basis in terms of whether they feel we are under or over borrowed. So if you're over borrowed, then you don't take any more borrowing, and you use your balances internally. And if you're under borrowed, then you have to consider whether it's the right time in the market to borrow personally.
James, what you're suggesting there is that borrowing represents basically a working capital position rather than long term.
It includes long term within it.
And it's the long term.
Yeah.
I fully understand working capital. I'm sure we all do. Where I'm really going here is our long term debt. The sticky debt. For various projects and so forth. I mean, is that coming down as well? So absolutely. If I share the long-term debt, as I say, the only thing we took out was the HRA, and the other long-term debt that we've had was basically debt that was built up in the 90s and the early noughties. Okay. That comes to, from memory, I think it's about £300 million of other debt that we've got sat there. That's all fixed. So it's not exposed in any way to interest changes that we're seeing at the moment. However, it was fixed at dates in the 90s and the noughties, which obviously was considerably higher than from post-2008 until 12 months ago. So it swings around about in relation to that. So therefore, we have not needed to replace that debt. So as some of that debt is not going to be paid off for another 30, 40, 50 years, but some of it is maturing
over the last few years and in the coming years. As that matures, we pay it off. The question is, do we need to replace it? And for the last decade, we haven't needed to replace that. So we haven't taken out any additional borrowing.
Okay, that's a great answer. I really hope that's a difficult one gets into the minutes, but because I think that's really important as to the role of this committee when it comes particularly to this review of the annual accounts. Thank you.
Well, I've no doubt that our committee clerk consults people like James to ensure that she's got the correct nuances on what he's said and what members have said.
I'll just
every confidence that it will get into the meeting.
And he's very welcome to consult me, so it doesn't only get James's view on what was said as well. It's great to have the control over the minute writer. Thank you.
Roger.
Two small questions, Chairman. First, about repayment of debt. We do have some debt, and when I've asked before, it was that if we try to repay debt early, the extra charge to us would be more, would not make good monetary sense. With the rise of interest rates, now, if you repay debt so that the lender can then lend the money somewhere else at a higher interest, is that still the case or not? Because debt is paid out of revenue, so it may well be the capital or whatever, we can pay some of the debt off and save on revenue consequences by paying that interest. Is that still tipped over, that it does not make monetary sense to repay the debt? Thank you. And I've got another one afterwards, Chairman.
Okay, so if I may, Chair. It's a good question. I'll go back and check that. It is something that, I say, our advisors advise us on. So I haven't been personally updated to say whether that position has changed. Had that position changed, I would have expected to be updated. So it's effectively, I haven't heard, therefore I'm assuming, but I will check that out. The point behind that is you're absolutely right. There's a premium that gets paid if underlying borrowing level and interest rates go up, then that premium reduces. The problem we have, of course, is because we're paying debt off anyway, our cash balance is therefore falling. If we therefore need to replace that loan, there's absolutely no point paying it off, paying a smaller premium and then having to borrow at a higher rate. So we need to keep that equation under consideration.
The other question I have, Chairman, and that's on page 213, usable reserves. The question I've got is usable capital receipts reserve is 0. I thought under certain circumstances, if we have some capital receipts, we can actually spend that because of the savings that would be accrued if we do it. So have I remembered that correctly about usable capital receipts? I see it's 0, and it is 0, but it's just a query whether my understanding of that is correct.
So I'll hand over to Chair in relation to why that number is 0. In terms of your wider point, capital receipts generally can be used to fund capital expenditure and reduce the requirement for borrowing, reduce the impact on revenue generally. But in terms of this specific reserve, I'll hand over to Gerald to explain that why the position is showing as 0, despite the fact we do have capital receipts.
Gerald, did you hear all that?
I did. Sorry, I was just trying to get off mute. So, yeah, in terms of usable capital receipts, we can set them aside against our MRP. So rather than hold them in a reserve, that's how we treat them for that next year. Neil will have more detail, I think, on that. Neil, would you like to come in and just explain how that works? Because you've obviously been involved in that previously.
Well, yeah. So, as James said, you can either use capital receipts to fund new capital expenditure or to debt, but also what we can do at the end of the year. If we do have capital receipts, we can set them aside. That reduces down our CFR for the following year, and that then gives us a lower MRP charge in the following year. So it's just really a accounting adjustment that allows us to make a revenue saving in the following year until we need the capital receipts to fund new expenditure.
Happy with that?
I'll think about it, Chair.
It's always difficult to take an explanation in from a disembodied voice, isn't it?
With respect, yeah, but I think I understand it, but I just need to just work it around.
I think if I may, Chair, just to try and put it in simple terms, we do have capital receipts. They're just not shown within that reserve. They're offset against the MRP, which is shown in another part of the statement.
Okay.
So the capital receipts are over here, and there's what Neil explained was the benefits of doing it that way. But in terms of your specific question, yes, we do have capital receipts. Yes, they're shown in the statement. They're just not shown in that reserve.
I don't know whether Jim's aware that in local government you can't use capital receipts for revenue expenditure. Right. A private firm, if it makes money on a connected capital receipt, can obviously do what he wants with it. But in local government, we're not allowed to use capital receipts for revenue expenditure. It's got to go back into further capital expenditure or support of capital expenditure. You may be aware of that. No, sorry if I'm...
Chairman, no, I was not.
Yeah, one other comment for Jim, and it was an earlier question he raised about, council going bust or anything like this. I think there is one council in the country who has put a precept of nearly 15%. The government have permitted them to do that in order to try and increase their money so that they can continue to operate. At present, we're stuck at 5% or 4.99%, but one council is up at nearly 15%. If I'm
actually
right,
Roger, if I may, it's that's not the precept, that's council tax.
Council tax.
Yeah.
Terminology.
Yeah. I mean the precept's what gets raised by the local parish, basically, right. And there is no limit on that. I mean, I've one who, well, it's not in my area, which is at 15%. And why was that? It was to pay for the swimming pool. But the council tax, is, unless you have a referendum, can only go up to, what is it, Rob?
A useful diversion, but we're being stray away.
So, yeah. Anyway, that's how you raise money, isn't it, Joe? So, absolutely.
Right. Now, I have an issue. If I can take you all to page 104, it's the second page of the report, page 2 of the actual report. I'm going to open the cupboard door and take hold of the skeleton. If I may explain, Jim, we have an external auditor and who is represented today by Grant Patterson. Our Grant Thornton are our external auditor, and Grant Patterson attends every meeting either in person or on screen to assist us with our concerns. But I now have a very serious concern about the fact that this authority pulled out all the stops to be able to complete its statement of accounts by May the 31st. And we find that our external auditors have not even started to carry out their work on the accounts, which is supposed to be completed in time for the accounts to be published by the 30th of September. And I find this very concerning, Grant, and very worrying. And perhaps you might be able to offer some assurance as to how your company is going to achieve your assessment of our accounts in timely fashion.
Right, thank you, Chair. I'll probably start with as you're looking at 2022-23. I'll start with 22 and then work backwards because you presume there was an update on 21-22 and 2021. In terms of 22-23, we have been undertaking planning work in the background. We are still awaiting some responses from the council, particularly around some of the questions around IT. So we will be bringing a, hopefully they'll be bottomed out in the next week or so. So we will be bringing the formal plan for 22-23 audit to the July audit committee. In terms of the overall timeline, I have communicated with James in terms of broadly where we are on 22-23. We have also been working in the background to try and look at the accounts and work with the finance team, see if we can pick some samples early, even ahead of the audit plan. So we are looking to get some testing underway. My current view, and it does to a certain extent pick up on what the Section 151 officer said earlier around our resourcing is a little bit fluid at the moment because, as has been alluded to, some councils have provided with accounts like yourselves, some haven't. So we are having to have a look at that going forward. Our current proposal in relation to this, and it's not quite in line with, I think, hopefully what the council expectation are, is that we will complete all of our substantive audit work by the end of September, because that will then allow us to, I suppose, in a way, step away from your finance team. I do not believe that we have been in position to formally report an audit findings report by that time, but it should be done within 1 or 2 months of that. So we are still playing catch up. I think as a firm, we are ahead of many of the other firms in this area. So the way it is, and we need to finalise that as we put the 22-23 plan together for the next audit committee, is we will complete our substantive audit work in terms of hopefully in terms of the detailed testing we need to do, the time that really does absorb, I suppose, the resources of your finance team by the end of September, and then we'll be looking at the final financial reporting after that. We are taking up again, I think, your other issue around delays in the market. I know that there is currently a parliamentary inquiry going on or in the background, or one of the committees is looking at that. We are investing heavily in our people to increase the number of people actually within the profession, and we have a number of people starting in September. That will take a little bit of time to work through the system, but we are investing there to hopefully, and that's put in place greater resilience in relation to our audit teams going forward, to hopefully then get us back formally on track. And as James has alluded to, the statutory deadline now is still the end of September. I think that might depend upon, I think we're still, in terms of the overall, whether that stays at that, around the role of the FRC in terms of some of the balances we need to look at. But in terms of the expectation of auditors now and how much work we are expected to do, that in the September deadline continues to be a challenge for all firms and not ours. So we have plans in place for 22-23, and that we will formally communicate that to you in our audit plan in July. In relation to the two other sets of accounts that are currently outstanding in 21-22, again, that audit work is now substantially complete. There has been an issue around information that's come out as part of the 22 triennial valuation audit of the pension fund that may indicate that the council's pension liability might be materially different based upon the updated information. We've communicated with the council that our view as a firm, and this is also consistent with other firms, is that we're therefore likely just to need an IS 19 report rerun just to confirm that either it is materially or not materially misstated, and that then will be the final piece of work in relation to 21-22, and then I will move to be signing that off. In relation to 2021, I had hoped to issue my opinion by the date of this audit committee. I think I've now looked to do that by the end of the month, so that one should be cleared by the time we next meet. We've done all the work on that primarily in relation to that and in the infrastructure elements going through that. So there are plans in place to bring you into line or back up to speed and clear the backlog. So I suppose what I'm looking at, hopefully by the next audit committee, we'll be signing up, have signed 2021, in a position to issue an opinion on 21-22, and then we will be into the 22-23 audit. So that's the broad timeline that we're working to right now.
If I can make one point to follow that up in relation to the 22-23 audit, Since we have completed our audit, or our staff have completed our end of the audit in time by the end of May, that should surely give us priority over all the other authorities who have not been able to achieve that and are still, as I understand it, not completed their audit. I'm looking for assurance that, having completed our audit on time, we will receive priority over others who haven't received, been able to complete their audit yet.
I can say, Chair, that in terms of the timelines of the audit, we have brought you forward on that very reason, because I think that we've got a joint team that's working across yours and another audit. That audit isn't quite ready yet, so we are prioritising the work of that team on your audit, and then we'll move on to them. So that's the way we're looking to work our resourcing. It's not quite straightforward because, you know, in terms of, we like to try and keep a degree of continuity with the same audit manager, the same in charge auditor to communicate with you, rather than just lifting and dropping different teams in at different times. So the resources can get complicated, but you are in the early tranche of audits that are going ahead.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that. We shall look forward to the next update from you on this matter. But do bear in mind that as a committee, we are extremely concerned that when we play our part in achieving the timescales the government sets down, we are then find our external auditors are struggling to achieve their part. Thank you.
I have noticed that, Chair. I mean, I think in terms of 23, I think I have to point out that we are still awaiting some information requests from the audit from the council itself in relation to our planning of the audit as well. So I accept that we will. We need to work better, and we need to get ourselves back on track. And generally, we've had a good working relationship with the council, so I see no reason why that shouldn't continue. But you know, we will. The challenge in auditing continue. The expectations on us and the quality that's required from our audits, it does take time now. We will be working more, closely with the council in terms of that, and I think we are looking about whether maybe working on site over the next few months to help maybe get through some of the backlogs might work. It's just a different way, rather than being totally remote and elements like that. We will continue to work with the council around to look to see if we can make some efficiency gains and then bring us back onto track as part of the audit. So.
Well, thank you, Grant. I have to say we have had a long and pleasant relationship as a council with Grant Thornton, and I wouldn't wish this issue to strain that relationship. Right. Yes, Simon.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think you've touched on it. I think Grant has as well. But we are now, I think it's 2 audits which haven't been signed off. What is it? 2021, 22. I mean, I'm not sure that would be legally permissible if we had to file at Companies House, would it, James? I mean, how long can an audit drag for whatever reason? And I don't know the reasons. I'm sure there'll be reasons for it, but to my way of thinking, it's just not acceptable that we haven't signed off the the 2021 to your audit by now for whatever reason.
So,
yes, you.
If I may, Chair, one comment I will make in relation to the specific statutory position. I don't know whether the Chair or Grant can answer that, but the concern from my point of view is that we are progressing into the 23-24 financial year, the biggest savings plan programme we've ever had as a local authority, and the basis on which that is set. We don't have independent assurance in relation to those accounts for 3 years. Effectively, as Grant has said, the 2021 figures are done and they're ready to sign those off, but haven't yet. Nevertheless, until that line goes on, the signature goes on the bottom of the paper, all of the assurance for the authority in relation to 23-24 falls upon myself and the professionalism of the finance team. We don't have that independent assurance to fall back
on. Thank you, Chair. I mean, I will expedite 2021 as soon as possible, so that will be, we can draw that. And I think actually the point that that James has made in relation to the savings plans. We'll pick that up as part of our value for money work. I think we are looking at that right now, and we picked up on those savings plans and those issues. So that actually is in progress right now. I don't know if it'll be finished in time enough to bring to the July audit committee ahead of that. So, and then I think once we've done 2021, I think 21, 22, it should be relatively straightforward, but I will bring that. I will look to see if I can get both of them done for the next audit committee is the aspiration, and we'll report that at the next time. In terms of the statutory framework, it's all phrased around publication requirements for councils in relation to not so much in they must be audited. It's you must publish as you have done by the end of May, and then you should publish accounts again by the end of September. And if they are not completed, then you have to put a note in saying why the audit is not complete. So it's not in that sense. I think the members are quite right. I think there are different in terms of Companies House. There'll be sanctions, etc. If you were a listed company, and I'm not a commercial expert, but there will be different approaches to sanctions. We are quite conscious that we need, as a firm, and I think the sector as a whole, does need to get back into balance. And I think that's part of the conversations if you're listening to select committees challenges around how that might happen. And then hopefully, and then I'll just pick up on James's point, is, as I say, we've not found any significant issues in the actual financial reporting of the council. So in that sense, but that will then give you an independent assurance on the baseline from which you're working. And that's also say alongside that, we will also be reducing our views and judgments in relation to value for money and the challenges that the council is currently experiencing.
Thank you, Grant. I think we've elabored that sufficiently. The draft statement of accounts before us. Shall we approve the draft statement of accounts, members? All in agreement? Thank you. Item 9 on the agenda is to note the date and time of the next meeting, 20th of July. Just on this matter, can you confirm to us, Katie, the training? We've had a sort of shuffle around on the proposed training date. Can you confirm exactly what we've agreed now?
Yeah, so we've got a training session on the 14th of July, which will be via Teams. And the proposed agenda, there's an update from Ben J on finance. There'll be an update from David Baker on the IT environment, and an update from Barry and possibly Tim Collard on the legal and governance structure changes and what those teams now look like and what they're responsible for.
Thank you. And that's 10 o'clock on Teams.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you should all have had the invite. I think most of you have been big set.
The dates being moved around. I simply wanted to get it quite clear in members' minds, to my mind and members' mind.
10 o'clock or 11? I just want to check.
10 o'clock.
It's 10. Fine, good. Thank you.
We get it clear in members' minds, as well as mine. Just
otherwise,
so hopefully we have a full team out for training. Shall we agree to exclude the press and public from the next item? All agreed? Thank you. We then come to the...
One moment, Brian. I've just got to stop the line.